For more than 100 years, Canadian law had this really strange and frankly deeply unequal standard for the age of consent. It was a kind of legal puzzle that ended up protecting some young people but leaving others vulnerable. And it all came down to the specific type of sexual act. So, how in the world did that happen? I mean, why would Canada keep a law on the books that so clearly treated people differently, especially when, as we'll see, multiple courts had already called it unconstitutional? To figure that out, we got to go back in time. So to really get why this change was so important and also so controversial, we first have to look at the law itself and its really long, complicated history. Okay, let's do a quick timeline here. Way back in 1890, the age of consent gets raised from 12 to 14. Then, in 1969, we see this huge leap forward when homosexual acts between adults over 21 are finally decriminalized. But that inequality, it kind of sticks around. In 1988, the age for anal intercourse is lowered, but only down to 18. And that leaves us, in the early 2000s, with this really bizarre legal split. And this slide just lays it out plain and simple. For most sexual acts, the age of consent was 14, but for anal intercourse, it was 18 unless you were a husband and wife. Now, this wasn't just some minor legal quirk. This was a major inequality written right into Canada's criminal code. And it would take a pretty shocking international incident to finally force a change. You know, sometimes it just takes one single high-profile case to shine a huge spotlight on the flaws in a legal system. And for Canada's age of consent laws, that catalyst was the case of Dale Eric Beckham. The story kicks off in March of 2005. A 31-year-old American man, Dale Eric Beckham, gets on a plane and travels from Texas all the way to Ottawa. And his purpose for the trip? To meet a 14-year-old Canadian boy that he'd connected with and groomed over the internet. But this is where police hit a legal brick wall. They found Beckham and the boy in a hotel room, but because the 14-year-old, who had clearly been manipulated, insisted that everything was consensual, the law actually tied their hands. Beckham couldn't be prosecuted for a serious crime in Canada. Think about that. The very law that was supposed to protect children was being used as a shield by a predator. It was unbelievable. And what happened next was just a jaw-dropping difference in justice. In Canada, Beckham pled guilty to a minor pornography charge and was just deported. But back in the United States, he was arrested and eventually sentenced to 17 years in prison. This case sent a crystal clear message. Canada's laws had created a potential haven for child predators. The public outcry was immediate and people demanded reform. The Beckham case and the public uproar it created, it really sparked two major waves of legislative reform. Both were aimed at trying to fix Canada's outdated and, well, unequal laws. So the first response was the Tackling Violent Crime Act in 2008. It raised the general age of consent from 14 up to 16. And it created these close-in-age exemptions to avoid, criminalizing teenage relationships. And that was definitely a step forward. But, and this is a huge but, look at that last point. The age of consent for anal intercourse was left at 18. The fundamental inequality, it was still there. And at the heart of all this was one specific law, Section 159 of the Criminal Code. This was the part of the law that singled out one sexual act and gave it a higher age of consent. Now, what's wild is that by this point, appeal courts in Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Nova Scotia, they had all already ruled that Section 159 violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And yet, there it was, still on the books. Finally, in June 2019, more than a decade after that first attempt at reform, Bill C-75 came along and officially repealed Section 159. This move finally equalized the age of consent at 16 for all forms of sexual activity, ending a legal discrepancy that had lasted for over a century. But man, the path to get there was filled with debate. Yeah, these changes were not universally celebrated. Not at all. Raising the age of consent and how it was done sparked a really fierce debate from a lot of different corners of society. So on one side, you had this really broad coalition of supporters. Groups like the Toronto Police Service and the Canadian Crime Victim Foundation, they argued that raising the age to 16 was a crucial tool. It would give police more power to fight against internet predators and protect vulnerable kids. But LGBTQ2+ advocates saw that 2008 reform as a massive failure. Hilary Cook from Eagle Canada put it bluntly, saying the bill was just an attempt to score partisan points because it completely sidestepped the discriminatory nature of Section 159. It left the core problem of inequality totally unsolved. Then you had public health organizations raising a totally different kind of concern. The Canadian AIDS Society warned that raising the age of consent could actually backfire. They feared it would make young people more secretive about sex, which in turn would make them less likely to go get condoms or seek out information, putting them at a higher risk for HIV and other STIs. Others focused on the rights of young people themselves. Andrea Cohen from the Canadian Federation for Sexual Health argued that the law didn't do much to actually protect youth from harm, and instead it infringed on their right to make their own decisions about their own sexuality. And finally, there was this other interesting critique about judicial flexibility. Peter Dudding of the Child Welfare League of Canada pointed out that when you create these arbitrary, hard cutoff ages, you take away a judge's ability to look at the specific, individual circumstances of a case involving teens, and that could lead to some really unfair outcomes. Okay, so if we zoom out for a second, the final repeal of Section 159 back in 2019, it wasn't just a simple legal cleanup. You have to understand it as part of a much wider moment of national reckoning that was happening in Canada. Back in 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau delivered a formal apology in the House of Commons for the historical persecution of Canada's LGBTQ2 communities. And his words really captured the spirit behind this legal change. He said, "For state-sponsored systemic oppression and rejection, we are sorry. For abusing the power of the law and making criminals of citizens, we are sorry." So, at the end of the day, getting rid of this law was about so much more than just removing an unconstitutional, so-called zombie law from the books. It was a really symbolic and substantive step in Canada's ongoing effort to reconcile with a history of state-sponsored discrimination. Which leaves us with a fundamental question that this whole debate really brings to the surface, right? How does a society strike that perfect balance between the urgent need to protect its most vulnerable young people and the equally important need to respect the personal rights and autonomy of all its citizens? It's a tension that continues to shape our laws and our policies today.